So the idea of today is to help you make choices in terms of priorities for your own school's developments. What I'm going to suggest is the curriculum and teacher capacity will have a bigger benefit for your students than anything else you could focus on. So I want to convince you that we need to improve student achievement. We need to improve teacher quality. That's the basic non-negotiable. We used not to believe that. We used to think that all teachers were roughly similar. People would say, I want a well-qualified teacher in every classroom. I don't. I want a good teacher in every classroom. Turns out not to be the same thing. Turns out that teacher qualifications tell us very little about how good that teacher is. The consequence of this is the only way to improve education at scale is to make the teachers we've got better. What I sometimes call the love the one you're with strategy. I think it's really important because some heads believe that my school could be great if I could only replace these teachers with better ones. There ain't any better teachers out there. Okay, so let's take a look at the argument in more detail. You probably know that with more education, people earn more money. One of the surprising things about Britain is as the number of graduates in the workforce has doubled, the graduate premium has held up pretty well. The fact is, education still produces a huge salary premium. It also improves health. The OECD asked adults in Britain, are you in good health? Those who left school at 16, 66% said yes. Those who left school at 18, 76% said yes. Graduates, 86% said yes. For society, the benefits include lower criminal justice costs, lower healthcare costs, and most surprisingly, increased economic growth. You know this test called PISA that comes around every 3 years? If we could raise the scores of British 15-year-olds by 25 points, that was just the improvement that Poland made in a 10-year period, so it's clearly possible. The net impact on British GDP would be, over the next 50 years, 5.5 trillion pounds. Now, I don't want to pretend that education is mostly about the world of work. It's not. I think the most important reason to educate young people is to take control of their own lives. I think it's also important that we actually pass on civilization from one generation to the next, passing on the best that has been thought and said, as Matthew Arnold said many years ago. But I do think that democracy only works with a certain level of education. So I think that an important role for education is preparation for democratic citizenship and preparation for the world of work. And we have to do all of these things. We can't just pick and mix. We have to do all of these things, and that means that any education system is a series of compromises. That's the biggest issue, or curriculum, is how are you going to actually work with these trade-offs? I do want to focus on the world of work for a little while, not because it's more important, but it is the one where things are changing fastest. So labor economists routinely classify jobs into 5 categories. Has anybody here ever tried to help a parent with a computer problem over the phone? Challenging work, isn't it? Okay, another example of what economists call complex communication. There's expert thinking and problem solving, like medical diagnosis. Plumbing in an existing building is called non-routine manual. It's manual work, you work with your hands, but it's non-routine because every job is different. Plumbing in a new building is routine manual because every job is the same. And then in between those, you've got alphabetically there, routine cognitive, straightforward office work, filing, claims processing, diary management. So my question for you is, which of these categories of job is disappearing fastest from the workplaces of the rich countries of the world? I can reveal the answer is actually D. Now, the reason that routine cognitive jobs are disappearing fastest is very simple. Computers are less complex than robots. We think playing chess is an amazing human achievement, but for £1 now, you can buy an app for your smartphone that will beat most human beings on the planet at chess. What we can't get machines to do is to stack shelves at Tesco. So what's really interesting is, this is called Moravec's paradox. The things we thought would be hard to automate, like chess, turn out to be much easier than the things we thought would be easy to automate, like the sort of thing a 2-year-old can do, which is go and pick up the blue ball. This chart shows the American labor market, which is probably better researched. Every circle there is a job in the American economy. The horizontal axis is how much you get paid, from about $0 to $120 per hour. The vertical axis is what proportion of that job could be automated over the next 30 years with existing technology. And so over on the right here, you've got things like surgeons. And even there, 20% of the job can be automated. Up here, you've got some jobs where most of the job can be automated. Very few jobs will be destroyed. So here's just one more example of that. In 1980, US banks employed approximately 375,000 cash points, ATMs, or automated teller machines, as they call them in the US. And over the next 30 years, they employed 550,000 tellers. They installed 375,000 ATMs. So what was the impact on these cash points being installed on the number of bank tellers being employed? The correct answer is E. Everybody assumes that technology destroys jobs. It doesn't. What technology does is to take the simple bits of people's jobs and automates them, which means that they can be more productive. So what they found in America was the installation of ATMs took away the least productive or least revenue-generating part of tellers' jobs. So they were free to do other kinds of things, and it reduced the cost of running a bank branch, which meant that far more bank branches were opened. And right now, what is really interesting is how government messing with education has had a pretty negative impact. So I don't know if you know this, but there was no government messing in education between 1944 and 1988. Basically, the 1944 Education Act, think about that, during the Second World War, created the education system we have pretty much in this current form. And basically, people left it alone for a long time. We don't know whether it got better or worse, but if you ask me, what is the common thread in countries that are doing really well around the world? It's not messing about with education. The Finns had an extraordinarily acrimonious debate in the late 1960s about whether education should be selective or should it be comprehensive. And the debate was concluded, the comprehensive argument won, and here's what's really interesting and very Finnish. The people who lost the argument agreed they'd lost the argument. And from then on, they said, okay, so we're going to have a comprehensive system. Let's make it a great comprehensive system. Same in Singapore. I think the Prime Minister said at one point, teach less to learn more. That was their big steering idea. And we'll play with that for about 10 years to see how it goes. But basically, what we could see is that all the government messing with education, I mean, it's probably caused a drop in science. It's probably caused, we're back up to where we were about 20 years ago, basically. So we're not really preparing young people in the way we should be. So we've got a lot of work to do. Just to highlight this, we have something between 15 and 20% of students failing to reach survival levels of achievement in numeracy, literacy, and science. And yet, in the advanced economies of the next 20 to 30 years, 30% of jobs could be offshored, and around about half of the work currently being done can be done by machines with existing technology. So that's why I think we need to be doing better in education, particularly at the lower end. So let's look at briefly before lunch, we'll look at some principles for curriculum design. So what I'm going to suggest is there are 7 things that you need to think about in terms of curriculum design, and these are basically things to trade off. So I'm going to list them here, I'll go through them each individually. A curriculum needs to be balanced, rigorous, coherent, vertically integrated, appropriate, focused, and relevant to the students. So I'm just going to take you through these things very briefly. The first one is balanced. Why do you teach the subjects you do? The things on the left are the things we choose to teach. The things on the right are things we choose not to teach. Why? One school surveyed its 11 to 16-year-olds and asked them, what is it that you're not learning in school that you think would be really important to learn in school? It's not on either list, by the way. Any idea what kids said? What do you think kids say that they think? No, that was second. Money management was second. It's first aid. Kids thought it was really important. I think they're probably right. Interesting, isn't it? That we don't teach that. So why not? Because it's not an academic subject, maybe. I think media studies is pretty important, especially when you look at what people believe about TV channels and which media is biased and things like that. But anyway. Okay, so there's that issue about which subject you teach. So, rigorous. What I'm suggesting is that the division of subjects that we have in our school curriculum is not arbitrary. These things we call history, geography, mathematics, science, they are actually different ways of thinking about the world. And they have ways of thinking that are not natural, but are important. For primary schools, I think one of the big issues here is whether we focus on subjects or themes. So the point is, subject-based curricula, we're doing maths now, is really good for developing maths, but then kids tend to isolate their knowledge into different areas. Theme-based stuff is really good for getting kids to see across different areas, but the trouble is it often doesn't develop the mathematics or the scientific thinking that kids need. There's another trade-off here. The important point is what trade-offs you're going to make. But I think we have to have, if you want kids to get good at mathematics, there has to be some specifically mathematical focus. Otherwise, you just won't get it. And that's why the theme-based stuff can often be unhelpful. Just to illustrate this, here's a comprehension passage for you. Now, there's one word that you might not be familiar with, the word manifold. The manifold in this passage refers to the flux of sensory experience. So it's all the photons that are coming into your eyes, all the sound waves that are coming into your ears, all the sensations that are coming into your fingertips, and your body sensors, all the chemicals that are coming into your nose. That's the manifold, okay? So now I've explained that all the words you should be familiar with. So what's the answer to the question? What is the main idea of this passage? What's the problem? You know all these words, don't you? Any words you're not familiar with? No. The reason you haven't got a clue what this passage is writing about is because you don't understand what Immanuel Kant is trying to do with this passage. What he's trying to actually suggest is that the way we make sense of our experiences, our sensory experiences, is actually learned. And it's really interesting. You know the Muller-Lire illusion, where you have a straight line like that with arrowheads either going like this or like that, and we see the one with the spreading arrowheads is bigger. In fact, people in Africa growing up in circular huts don't see that illusion. The Muller-Lire illusion works because the one with the arrows spreading out away from this line looks like an internal corner, and the other one looks like an external corner, which we assume is nearer to us. So it's only the fact that we are brought up in buildings with external and internal corners that leads us to see that illusion. Even the way we see things is determined by our experience. And so basically the correct answer is C. Intuition occurs through a category. That's what Kant is trying to say. And the reason you had no idea what the correct answer was not because you didn't understand the words, you did not have the background knowledge to make sense of what the paragraph was being written about. In the same way, there's a passage I use with American teachers about cricket, where Mike Hussey is unlucky to receive the dreaded finger just before lunch. And of course, American teachers have got no idea what the dreaded finger is, because they think it's a rude gesture. They don't realize that in cricket, it's the appeal, it's the LBW. The important point is, they don't know they don't know. If you don't have the background knowledge, you make up a meaning and you think you know what it's about. But the background knowledge makes you read things at a different level. And so, as E.D. Hirsch says, comprehension depends on constructing a mental model that makes the elements fall into place, and equally important, enables a listener or reader to supply essential information that is not explicitly stated. Let me give you an example. He got a walk to first, stole second, reached third on an error, and scored on a sacrifice fly. What's going on here? Baseball. But do you know how many outs there were when the batter came to the plate? No, because you can't construct a situation model that makes all the facts fall into place. And you certainly can't do it quickly enough to make sense of what I'm saying. And that's why we're learning more and more that background knowledge is the key thing here. And this is what the simple view of reading stresses. The idea is that background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge contribute to the kind of comprehension side, and the decoding processes lead to the word recognition and these are intertwined. This is increasingly automatic, that is increasingly strategic. And so the important point is our curriculum needs to be providing kids with the background knowledge so they can make sense of what they're reading. So one of the big debates we see in schools is skills versus content. And what E.D. Hirsch points out is it's really difficult to make any sensible distinction between the two. Skill is content, and content is skill. So he says the character of an academic skill is constrained by the limitations of short-term working memory. We'll talk about more of that in a minute. Academic skill is procedures and content, what you do and what you do with what you do. Procedural skills, such as turning letters into sounds, must be initially learned as content, but then they become automatic. And so we think about all this like writing. You know, young children can't write very well, partly because they're not practicing it, but partly because the act of writing takes up valuable processing space. So remembering what a letter B, which way around a letter B is, actually means you have to think about that rather than think about what you want to write. So now let's think about progression. The vertically oriented curriculum. Okay, so in England, the most common is to start with a square, and then the rectangle, and then the triangle, and then the parallelogram, and then the trapezium. In Japan, they don't do that. They start with the rectangle, then do the square, it's a rectangle. So why bother with this, just a rectangle with equal sides? So start with the rectangle, and then the parallelogram before the triangle. Why? Because you can always put two triangles together to get a parallelogram. You can't put two triangles together to get a rectangle unless it happens to be a right-angled triangle. So by careful curriculum sequencing, you actually reduce the amount of work that kids have to do. So basically, the whole, and then the trapezium comes after the triangle because the trapezium can be made into a parallelogram by flipping it through the middle and flipping it over. So what I'm just raising the possibility of is that careful curriculum sequencing can make a big difference to how easy it is for kids to access this stuff. Take the standard kinds of figurative language: alliteration, hyperbole, onomatopoeia, personification, and simile. In which order would you teach them? I don't know. What I do know is nobody thinks about this. And so what I'm suggesting is that micro-level curriculum sequencing is also important, as well as the macro-level stuff, giving teachers a chance to think about what's the best way to get this over to kids. And that's what makes Japanese lesson study so effective. Because they're thinking about those big issues when they're doing really mundane things like, should we teach the area of a triangle first or the area of a parallelogram? So what I'm saying is a lot of the hierarchies that we have are not natural. So there are some natural hierarchies. So I think it's pretty clear that we should do addition before multiplication. Multiplication before division, maybe. Turns out that multiplication is actually harder to understand than division. It's easier to do, but harder to understand. And that brings us back to the spiral curriculum. And so you've all heard of the spiral curriculum, but very few people know the actual quote from Jerome Bruner back in 1960. And the important bit comes down to the bottom here. So here, we might ask, as a criterion for any subject taught in primary school, whether, when fully developed, it is worth an adult's knowing, okay, first, and whether having known it as a child makes a person a better adult. Now, this is an extraordinarily strong criterion, because it's meaning if you can leave this until later without harming the child's development, then do so. The inclusion criteria, you might need this later, you will need this later. Neither of those first two criteria are good enough in my view. You might need this later, or you will need this later, are not criteria for including it now. The two important criteria are, this is useful now, even if you do not go any further, and you will need this later, and you will be significantly disadvantaged if you do not learn it now. I think those last two are the important criteria for inclusion in the curriculum. And that's how you end up with a reasonably parsimonious curriculum. And there's a kind of add-on here which links into the latest research on human memory. So the traditional model of memory is what's called the theory of disuse, proposed by Thorndike in 1913. Stuff gets learned, over time memories fade, if we cannot remember things, the memories are gone. And Robert Bjork's new theory of disuse distinguishes between two things: storage strength, how well something has been learned at any point in the past, and how easy it is to retrieve right now. Storage strength can only go up, retrieval strength goes up and down. So it's the fact that you have high storage strength, for the French word for ear, even though you can't retrieve it, so it's low retrieval strength, that enables you to recognize the word oreille in a list of French body parts. So, why is this important? Well, first of all, let me give you an example. The number of a hotel room you stayed in last year, unless it's particularly significant, you probably never learned it, never memorized it particularly strongly, and you can't remember it right now. If you're staying in a hotel room right now, and last night I stayed in the Stratford Hotel at the Stratford International Station, my room number was 219. I can remember that tonight, tomorrow maybe. In 2 weeks' time, I'll have no idea what it was. It has high retrieval strength, but low storage strength. If you can't remember the French for ear or the childhood telephone number, then it has low retrieval strength, but high storage strength, and government ID numbers we tend to remember because they're high in both. Here's what's important. The main research finding from human memory research is this: studying increases storage strength more when retrieval strength is low. So when you restudy something, when you've begun to forget it, that hour spent restudying it has a bigger impact on learning than if you studied it the next day. That's why spirals are important in the curriculum, because spirals support remembering. There is a thing called digit span that psychologists have studied for decades. You're given a string of numbers, and you have to repeat them back. Most people can do 6. Most people can do 7. Many people struggle with 8. So for many years, the world record was 11. The current world record is about 463. Lance Cherhart, a Texan. In the 2016, I think, World Memory Championships, he stood up on stage in an auditorium and listened to 463 numbers being repeated at the rate of 1 per second, and then 7 minutes. Can you imagine that? Standing on a stage, listening to numbers for 7 minutes, and then repeating them back perfectly, without a single mistake. And that's what we see all the time. People who seem to have good memories actually are using tricks to do with using long-term memory to make short-term memory more effective. Because you can't increase your short-term memory, you can only increase your long-term memory. And the really important thing is long-term memory, as far as we can tell, is infinite. And just a couple more examples of chess here. So these are some classic studies from chess. People were shown these chessboards for 5 to 15 seconds, and then they were given the pieces and asked to reconstruct what they'd seen. So 2 scenarios: a middle game with about 25 pieces on the board and an end game. Novice players got about 5 pieces right, a club player got about 9 pieces right, and an expert got 16 pieces right. So basically, experts, for a long time, were thought to have superior visual memory. They could memorize, they had better ways of envisaging things. But when the pieces were placed randomly, the novice players were just as good, almost as good as the experts. The experts were not remembering, they were recognizing. And so here's the simple model of human memory that I mentioned earlier. You've got short-term memory and long-term memory and the environment. So in the example of the countdown game, it was the fact that those numbers 25 and 4 were there, triggered that fact. 25 times 4 is 100, and that was brought into short-term memory by what you perceived. So the environment triggered the movement of that fact from long-term memory into short-term memory. Here's a really important point. Short-term memory is limited. We can't think about 7 things. Doesn't last for more than about 20 seconds. It has to be refreshed to keep that stuff in short-term memory. But as far as we can tell, long-term memory is limitless. That's why I argue that the main purpose of education is to build domain-specific knowledge, long-term memory. One more example, which is quite interesting. So some kids were shown So they heard and read a story on a player's experiences during a football game. They were tested 50 minutes later with a closed version of the test with 20 blanks. What's interesting is that the kids who are high in reading ability but low on football knowledge did much worse than the kids who are high on football knowledge but low on reading ability. Their ability to remember or to read things were far more strongly predicted by how much they knew about football than by how well good they were at reading. So just to tie that up, learning is a change in long-term memory, provided we think of memory broadly. And as Paul Kirschner and his colleagues say that the aim of all teaching, what they call instruction, is to alter long-term memory. Nothing's been changed in long-term memory, nothing's been learned. If we teach kids stuff that they can do today, but they can't do in 6 weeks' time, we haven't taught them anything. The final thing that I think is really interesting here is novices need to use thinking skills. Experts use knowledge. That's why when you scan the brains of experts, you don't get much cognitive activity, because they're not thinking, they're recognizing. So to summarize, why does curriculum matter? First of all, standards tell us what to teach. No, the national curriculum, perversely, is not a curriculum. It's a series of destinations. Here's what we want our kids to be able to do. How you get them there is a creative task performed by teachers. The real curriculum is what teachers do to get kids to where they need to be. People think that 16-year-olds are a lot better than 15-year-olds. Actually, when you actually map the distribution of achievement, it looks more like that. So what you've got there is the age cohort getting up and they're getting more spread out. But basically, if you took an 11-year-old and put them in a class of 10-year-olds, they'd be very slightly above average. They wouldn't be at the top of the class. So having a focused curriculum means leaving out stuff, which I've talked about already. But I like this quote because it comes from Sir Richard Livingston, who was president of Corpus Christi College at the University of Oxford in 1941. The test of successful education is not the amount of knowledge that a pupil takes away from school, but his appetite to know and his capacity to learn. If the school sends out children with a desire for knowledge and some idea how to acquire it, it will have done its work. Too many leave school with the appetite killed and the mind loaded with undigested lumps of information. The good schoolmaster is known by the number of valuable subjects that he declines to teach. We're now going to look at teacher capacity and thinking about how we can make teachers better. And so the first thing I want to just point out is that in England, we tend to focus on teacher evaluation more than we focus on teacher improvement. And a classic example would be the early career framework. I don't know if you're using the new DFE early career framework. It's got those 8 standards that people are meant to get better at. And we're always doing this. We're always listing all the things that teachers do. And here's the problem. If you give these frameworks to teachers, you're encouraging them to get better at everything. And some of those things matter to kids, and some of them don't. So the big idea here is that evaluation frameworks, of necessity, are always going to be comprehensive. They include everything that teachers do. The problem is that some of those things help kids, some of them don't. So, where should RFS be focused? The number one factor I didn't put in the list because it's too obvious. So the top factor was student socioeconomic profile. The one in the list, the correct answer to the question, D. The amount of teacher-directed instruction. A lot of you went for C, the amount of inquiry-based instruction. That was actually the second most negative. The most negative was poverty. The second most negative was the amount of inquiry-based instruction. That was even more negative than high student absenteeism. Now, some people have concluded from this that means that inquiry-based teaching is bad. You can't conclude it, because this is a snapshot, a cross-section. It could be that the reason that low achievement is found in classrooms where there's lots of inquiry-based teaching is because teachers are trying to get poorly motivated kids engaged by doing some interesting stuff with them,